One seems to hear words of good cheer from everywhere, filling the air. Oh, how they pound, raising the sound, calling the dead, telling the tale. Gayly the rainbow people sing songs of good cheer. Christmas is here. Merry, 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 ding dong. Merry, 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 ding dong. All that they said, dawn without dead day.
Ladies and gentlemen, will you please follow me in the Pledge of Allegiance? Color guard, hand salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Ready, front. Color guard, about face. Forward, march. You may be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for inviting us to participate in your ceremony tonight. The men who perform tonight are from the Spokane chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution. Each one of them has documented their ancestry back to the Revolutionary War. Tonight we're wearing the uniform of a soldier from Virginia who served with George Washington. My particular ancestor was in the Army, drafted in the Army at the age of 16 in 1781, and was stationed at Annapolis, Maryland. His name was Thomas Wills. I am a sixth generation Thomas Will. My first name is Thomas, and then I was there. In order to join the Sons of the American Revolution, you need to be a man over the age of 18 who can document your ancestry back to the Revolutionary War. It's never been easier than it is now with computers to do that. For the ladies, there's the Daughters of the American Revolution. And for the children who are under the age of 18, there's the Children of the American Revolution. Each one of these organizations promotes historical, educational, and patriotism throughout our country. We do programs in the schools, we post colors, we march parades. Both the SAR and the DAR are very active in that in the Spokane area. So if you're interested in joining the SAR or the DAR or getting the children into the CR, if you'll see me afterwards, I'll lead you down that path and show you how to do that. Thank you very much. Enjoy the evening.
We have a guest here who was very active in government. He became the governor of Massachusetts after the Revolutionary War. He was really one of the guiding lights and authors of the Constitution. And we're going to learn a little bit more about the Constitution tonight, as well as this man. And so I'd like to introduce to you our guest speaker here tonight, and that is Samuel Adams.
I'm very delighted and honored to be here in Virginia today because I see all the wonderful gaiety that is going on in this great celebration of Christmas. And I note that from the perspective that in Massachusetts and the northern colonies, being of a Puritan heritage, we did not celebrate Christmas in the same nature as the southern colonies and yourselves have done, and make the merry to that extent. As a matter of fact, from our Puritan heritage, all through the northern colonies, Christmas as a celebration was outlawed during that period of time. And there was actually laws on the books for over 57 years that stopped the celebrations of anything of Christmas. So to us, the day of December 25th was as normal as any other workday. And it was very interesting that the southern colonies would celebrate. And it was a lot to do with the differences in how we view from our
different backgrounds in our religious denominations. So throughout the northern colonies, you see, from having been in that Puritan ideals and bringing those across with us, that was from the Reformation perspective and a biblical point of view that no other day was holy except the Lord's Day. And so we never included that idea of taking and celebrating the birth of Christ other than every day. Our expectation was that his birth was something that we denoted every day, as well as we did his death and resurrection, and how it would transcend into our lives on a regular basis. Now, our friends to the south, and this extended into Pennsylvania with the Quakers, and the Presbyterians as they came over and into the Virginia Valley, they also did not celebrate. Now, our friends, our Scottish friends that settled in that valley all the way from Pennsylvania down through the Appalachians like that, they did celebrate in January for a week and have celebrations starting that new year. And it was a great time of inviting guests in and the firing of musket and enjoying the times with one another. As we moved into then Virginia and the other southern colonies, it was the whole idea of them being of an Anglican background that they celebrated Christmas very much like the Roman Catholics did and included that time of celebration in December 25th. So it's a very interesting dichotomy across the colonies as to how this time of Christmas was honored and celebrated. One of the things we did experience and why it was outlawed, especially in Massachusetts for a period of time, was that when the celebrations would happen and when they were allowed to happen, people would come and knocking on the doors of those that had more than what they might have had. And they would threaten. If you would not invite them in to participate in your family gatherings, then they would take and throw stones at your windows. They would take it and sometimes barge into your home and actually take your meals from your table. So this was very egregious to us, and we didn't see how that fit into the real honoring of Christ's birth. So it was a different perspective that the northern colonies had. And it really was not even past my time in the early 1800s that the northern colonies accept that whole idea of the celebration of Christmas as the southern colonies did. So it was a very interesting, again, that dichotomy. And it made the difference all through what was happening in that revolutionary period. One of the very interesting things that happened in the December period, though, and if you may remember it, I was accused, quite frankly, of being the stimulator of the whole idea. You see, we had this just egregious tax being laid on tea. So it was in December of all times, and Boston in December could be rather cold. And we called the people to order because these ships were coming in and bringing the tea with them. And we said we would not allow the tea to land. And all of the colonies agreed. There were some places where the tea was landed. In South Carolina and Georgia, they tried to land it in New York. Pennsylvania would not land the tea. And those places where it was landed, it was stored away because we were refusing as colonies all over to pay that tax. So what happened in that whole December time in Massachusetts, after we petitioned the governor, petitioned him 3 times, asking him to turn the ships away with the tea. But when that did not happen, I came back from the meeting with the governor and said, there's no more that we can do on this issue. And at that period, then some of our fellow members of what? The Sons of Liberty, they gathered, and they did raise up as dressed as Indians. And they went and threw the tea overboard. Not a person was hurt. Not any other property was damaged. But the tea was thrown overboard. And not only that, to make sure that the tea was not usable, as they rowed back in through the wharf, they stirred the tea into the water with their oars. So it was an interesting celebration. But more so, as time went by, a couple years later, did you know that Boston was under siege? Boston was under siege because of everything that we were doing at that time. That they brought in a number of troops. They landed them. And they landed them in such a way that they took over the commons. They even took over our homes. As you might know, Boston is a peninsula and a very narrow ability to take and go from off that land to land and into the greater area of Massachusetts. And because of that, they actually barricaded that isthmus, if you will, so that no food could enter in. And the Charles River was cut off. No food could come in. Well, we made sure that the food came in. I was in charge of gathering money and supplies from all through the colonies. We have good friends from Connecticut, and they brought a lot. And we were able to smuggle that food in and go through some of those barricades to take and make sure that the people were supplied because of the siege that Boston was under that day. That is through winter time as well. So there were a lot of things that were happening during that period of time. And I was engaged in many of the activities, all the way taken to the First Continental Congress. Now, before we ever got to the Congress, we were beginning to communicate with one another. And we did that through a process that was called the Committees of Correspondence. It started locally in Massachusetts. And one of my dear friends that I would invite to join me this evening, because I saw her here, was Mercy Ottis Warren. A delight to see you, Mercy. Would you please join me? Now, many of you may not know, but Mercy was and is such a great patriot. She is a peer of myself and my cousin John. I was born in 1722, and you were born in 1728. So we were peers in that. And she's just a formidable woman when it came to what it is that brought us liberty. You have to understand some of the things that you did tell us about what you're a playwright.
Well, I had 13 siblings and mostly brothers. And in those days, we couldn't get an education for women. But the boys in my family were tutors because they wanted to go to Harvard. And so I stood around and I listened to what the tutors said. So I learned to write. I write poetry and I do plays. And some of my plays are very biting, attacks on the British who are persecuting our colonists.
Yes. So she was a contemporary, and it was the meetings that we were having at the Warren home she was very instrumental in the whole idea of these committees of correspondence. We were going through and talking about all the different political ideas. Your brother, James Otis, was a close friend and collaborator of mine, and we did many things together. And unfortunately, he became very ill, and it set him aside. He had, we don't know what it would be termed, and he had some kind of illness, and it caused him to have, sadly, very sadly, to work on his capacities to continue to write and to speak, because he was a great orator. And we missed him dearly throughout the rest of the Revolution. But Mercy picked up where her brother left off. Because even as he was studying for his master's, if I remember, you were right there.
That's right. And I had correspondences of my own with some prominent women in the colony. Martha Washington was my friend, Abigail Adams was my friend, Mrs. Hancock was my friend, and we were writing letters to each other every day. And we would hear the men meeting, and we would sit with them almost as equals at a time when women were not equal. And we were corresponding, and we were corresponding with the men too, to share our ideas about liberty.
So the period was very strange, and we had just none of the men could have endured much of what happened, especially knowing what was required at the homestead if it was not for our wives. Myself, I understand what it was to be married and to lose my first wife. And she left me with 2 children. So I understand what it means to be a single father. And I raised those children until God blessed me with another wife. And fortunately for me, both of them had the first name of Elizabeth.
And poor Mrs. Adams, she had to move a lot because most people don't realize the wives of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were marked men and so were their wives. And their wives suffered greatly. And Mrs. Adams moved around a lot as word would come that the British were coming to arrest her. And some women really suffered during the Revolutionary years.
But it was their ability to stand strong that allowed us to pursue what we needed to do, especially in Congress. Myself in particular, and before we get to myself in particular regarding Congress, I honor my wife. You see, she put up with a lot. When I was a young man, my father wanted me to go into business, but my mother wanted me to be a lawyer or a minister. But my pursuit of liberty when I was at Harvard, which I went to at the age of 14, and to understand what Mercy's brother James and myself would endure as freshmen at Harvard was that our first test, if you will, our first assignment was given a chapter in the New Testament in Greek. And we had to accurately translate it from the Greek to English. So that was, we had to know Greek and Latin to read and write it and understand it in detail before we could even enter Harvard of the day. So the preparatory aspect of what you were going through with your brother also gave you some of that background and that history and the insights into those languages. So that was just an amazing time of education for yourself. You had a great deal of influence, and then what you were able to write and what you saw from the whole period and all the things that we were going through. The idea of being educated at that time was to raise up a citizenry. It was, in going to Harvard, was also to take and raise up a ministerial establishment. And I don't mean to establish it, but to raise up ministers. But there were great attorneys that came out of that. My cousin John, he went to Harvard, being 15 years younger than myself, and he became very active. And it wasn't until that dire day of the Boston Massacre that I was able to bring him in to the whole idea of participating in what was going on in our time and in the period of what we were fighting for at liberty. Now, as we made that whole transition in trying to understand before we get to Congress, because I was always about liberty. My master's degree, I was noted and made note of by the Kingsmen, because it was to the idea of what would it be to challenge the established ruler if the government couldn't be saved. And they said, oh, we're going to have to watch this Mr. Adams. You see, because what I read was Algernon Sidney. And Algernon Sidney challenged the authority of the divine right of the king. So it was very interesting. What was liberty? And oh yes, there is a thing such as liberty. So as we were meeting at the Warren home, and we were trying to look at just within the context of the colonies alone, what would it take? What would we do to take and be able to communicate and unite just the towns in Boston and Connecticut alone? Well, that's when Mercy came up with the idea of why not corresponding. The committees on correspondence, many a times, are credited to myself and Mr. Franklin. But quite frankly, my friends, it was Mercy Ottis Warren who came up with the idea, the influence into that community that the women can make. And as I stand before this group that is dedicated to the idea of raising up young women to the great ideals and principles of liberty and moving forward in their God-given talents to succeed in the rest of life, it is an honor to be able to communicate how influential the women were of that period. Not only that, my sister came up with the idea because the first Great Awakening was happening to cause reformation inside the churches, and then as it extended into the general public. Well, when we were going through that Stamp Act, that period of the Stamp Act, my sister came to me, having been in correspondence and a good friend with George Whitfield, who was preaching up and down all of the colonies. She suggested that I write to Mr. Whitfield, who had gone back to England. And she said, will you not ask him to go petition with the good graces that he has to Parliament and ask him to influence them to relieve us of this egregious act that is upon us? So I did. I wrote that letter to Mr. Whitfield, and I petitioned him and laid out all of the concerns and the pain and all of the egregiousness that was caused by that. And you can read in Mr. Whitfield's own writings that shortly after he received my letter, he went in and he talked to Parliament. And they did. They repealed the Stamp Act. They relieved us of that. And he says it was due to my petitioning that the Stamp Act would be relieved in the Parliament. Wow. That's the influence of my sister on myself. And she always had a great influence on me. She was older than I, but she had that influence on me to take that step and correspond with someone that she had been corresponding with all along and as a friend. You see many things that happened with that. So these committees of correspondence drew then all of us in the colonies together. We incited Virginia to take and come more and participate more into that, and they actually led the way in so many different ways. And so that was extremely important to have Virginia, because everybody was blaming everything on Massachusetts. But it was with Virginia adding to that we were able then to come together and go to that first Continental Congress. And there was great appeasement during that period. I brought forth only one time the idea of liberty and stepping away from our relationship with England. But I saw then that that wasn't going to go very far. So then at that time, we came relieved from that period and left it to come home and find out some more. What would happen? What would be the response of the king? Oh, the response was poor. He wouldn't listen to us. You see, you have to understand that we always petitioned the king. It was not Parliament, you see, because our charters, all of our colonial charters, our relationships, our covenants, if you will, were with the king. He had taken and repealed many of them, sent in his own governors, over, especially in the northern colonies, over the freedom that we had. We were allowed to self-govern. And that's what was greatly egregious. Self-governance begins with us as individuals, and as we then come together as a society and we build what it would take in an understanding as we would come together to then produce government. Well, after we got negative responses from the king, and Parliament started to lay on more egregious activities, we then called for that second Congress. And with that second Congress, then my cousin John, a young red-headed man by the name of Thomas Jefferson, Mr. Franklin, and another gentleman were assigned into the committee to take and write a Declaration of Independence. Myself and several others, Elbridge Gerry, Mr. Mason, and a number of others, we went and knew that if we were going to declare independence, we had to have a form of government. So with that, we were assigned to write the Articles of Confederation. That was the first Constitution of the United States as we made that Declaration of Independence. Now, that ratification of that didn't happen for many years. But the interesting thing is that all that while, our wives And Mercy was absolutely influential in a number of different things. Could you come back here for a moment? And as the revolution went through its history and its process, and we won our celebrated victories, somebody had a right to history. Could you tell us a little bit about what you did about the revolutionary history?
Well, I wrote a 3-volume set on the history of the Revolution, and I was pretty critical, and I was critical of people like John Adams, because we disagree on how much control the federal government should have. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, you will note that it says it was declared by the United States of America, small u. That means the states of America form the central government. And I was very concerned. We had many people that wanted a monarchy again, and we had many people who wanted a king. And I was fearful that because there was no Bill of Rights in the Articles of Confederation, and they weren't even being considered when they were talking about writing a constitution, I was very concerned that we would have a Bill of Rights to the citizens. And I felt that we could end up with a monarchy again.
And how important that 3-volume set was that when Thomas Jefferson became president, he ordered over 1,000 copies of it that would be given to every person in Congress, every senator and every congressman and Supreme Court justices. And not only that, the copies would be distributed to the states and the state legislature so that our posterity, they would know what the history of that period was, and that it would be handed down to our posterity in such a way that they would know that the coalescence of who we are as a people would stand on a principle that was called liberty. And that was the guiding element of the truths that everything was directed for. Because government in and of itself could form and become egregious. And as you mentioned, because there was no Bill of Rights, and the argument was that eventually the state should go away. And in the Constitution, there was the argument between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in particular, that the state should go away. And the Anti-Federalists warned over and over what could happen if the government turned into a runaway government. What would happen if the Supreme Court started doing legislation? What would happen if Congress all of a sudden understood that they could take the people's money and bribe the people so that they could continue in office, and that they could form and take over many other things? And if the Senate was not accountable to the states, what would happen? The Anti-Federalists warned of that. And so it was. Mercy was a fabulous Anti-Federalist, even though she had questions about federalism in itself. So it was very, very interesting in how she wrote that in that 3-volume set. And my cousin was not happy with you, was he?
John Adams and I viewed it, and we only patched it up toward the end of our lives.
Isn't it amazing? Mr. Hancock and I had some problems, and I mentored him. He was a young man, and he supported a lot of the activity because, again, with my wife, I never, my friends, the first job that my father was able to get me in the counting house, I was so enthralled with fighting for liberty even at that period of time that I was fired. I was let go because I would hardly be there. And I wasn't very good at numbers either. I just had no interest in that. But what happened is that because of that, my wife had to make do with the stipend that I received for being elected. And she was wonderful. People would say that when they would come to the Adams home, that she would entertain in such a marvelous way. So just the honor and the love and the correspondence that I had with her, similar to that, my cousin John had with Abigail. It was just the devotion, the love, and the honor of one another, and how she maintained all that she could, because the British took over our home in Boston. And so as she had to transition from place to place, she had to maintain the rest of our affairs. And you noted that was very difficult to do when you're not in your own home. So can you imagine your wives, gentlemen, that you have to go either off to war or you have to stand for liberty of what you believe in Congress for many years. Because I stayed to the end. I was one of the last in Congress as a transition. I only went home twice because I became suffering from some illnesses. But my wife had to take care of all of those affairs, and not in her own home. It took a very strong, dedicated woman to do that. A woman of faith, a woman of honor. And that's what yourself and all of those are. Now, here's one thing. Please. Now, he wrote through the revolution with us. He did many things. Could you speak a little bit to what he did?
Mr. Warren was one who was very faithful. And there weren't many that were, but he stood with some great men at the time, and there were not many of them. Most people don't realize Congress actually got down to 8 people at the end because people sort of lost interest in it.
So as we look at what it took to take and form our great nation, the history that was written and retained is amazing. Now, you and I have been grace. We have received a grace that not many do. We have been able to look into the future and see what we were talking about as both being anti-federalists and some of what has transpired over the time. What has been the vision and view from your perspective that America has become?
Well, our Constitution has been amended many times, and some of those amendments need to be reconsidered, especially the 17th Amendment.
Well, you were very strong on states' rights, were you not?
I was, and I did not want a strong central government, and I wanted a Senate that was representing the states.
Some of the things that we've had the privilege to look into from what we predicted were exactly some of those things that I noted a moment ago. As you see, we saw that the courts could transition, and that the courts could potentially make some differences and expand the whole ideas of self-governance. So as we look to the idea of how to rejoice as a people, especially in a great time of spirit and of faith, what are some of the things that we can encourage people with?
We need to be active as we were. We need to monitor what's going on around us, and we need to speak out like Mercy Warren and Samuel Adams did. They wrote to their friends, they stood in their communities, they organized, and we need to do that today.
And the first and foremost that I wrote about a number of times is we have to stand on our faith. There was a young man that came from France in about 1832 to 36. This young man came to study the penal system in America. And why was it that we did not have the prisons that they did in Europe? In France, his name was Alexis de Tocqueville. And some of his observations, even at that time, was that America did not designate the difference between religion and liberty and morality. And it stood firm in what that meant and how those were together. He even said things that when he looked at the greatness of America, he didn't see it in our harbors. He didn't see it in the commerce of our rivers. He didn't see it in the great farms and plains or the mountains or in the cities. It was not until he went into the churches and heard what was being preached from the pulpit that he understood the greatness of America. And what that meant to him, as my cousin John said, and even Addison said, that it takes that the Constitution that was given to the people was for a moral and a virtuous people. So as we think about this time, and as you in, Washington, are celebrating Christmas, it goes back to that understanding of who Christmas is about and how that transcends every aspect of our lives. Because it's not about the gaiety of the season. What it is about is the actions of the person that was born to redeem the people and to give them liberty. And when we understood liberty on a personal basis, then it came across all the nation, and it produced a great nation. And we would hope that you would enjoy this time and enjoy this season. What great celebration, as my friends up and down the Appalachian Valley did. That you would do it with dinners and enjoying one another and your family. And for those that are in those valleys, to even set off and enjoy the loud bang of your arms. That's how we celebrated. That's how my friends celebrated. And we would hope that you would celebrate in the tradition of your family and remember who Christmas is about.
Thank you, Mr. Bass.
One seems to hear words of good cheer from everywhere.